Edward Sterling stood in the towering penthouse of his San Francisco high-rise, gazing out at the fog-draped skyline. The city below pulsed with energy. Cars racing across bridges, startups thriving in industrial lofts, and people chasing dreams through illuminated streets. To an outsider, Edward embodied the pinnacle of success. As the CEO of a revolutionary tech company, his wealth and influence were unmatched, but inside, he felt hollow. "I've built an empire," he thought, staring at his reflection in the glass. Yet it means nothing without someone to share it with. What's the point of a legacy carved in stone if no one's left to carry it forward? Edward's face, sharp and composed, betrayed no hint of his inner turmoil. Yet the silence of his penthouse amplified the emptiness within him. Twice divorced, he had long since abandoned the idea of love. Both marriages had unraveled under the weight of ambition and distrust, leaving him convinced that relationships were messy liabilities he couldn't afford. Still, one desire lingered: a child. Not a partner tethered by promises, but an heir to carry his name and continue the Sterling legacy. The thought consumed him, a solitary flicker of hope in an otherwise barren emotional landscape. As he swirled the whiskey in his glass, Edward whispered to himself, "If I can't build a family the conventional way, I'll find another path." The next morning, Edward sat in his sleek office overlooking Silicon Valley. The hum of innovation surrounded him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His assistant had just left, leaving a stack of documents on his polished desk, but the usual buzz of deals and negotiations didn't hold his attentive. Instead, his mind churned over a single, audacious idea. A surrogate. For Edward, the concept was purely transactional. It wasn't love or companionship he sought, just the assurance that his legacy would endure. A child, his child, could exist without the mess of emotions that had derailed his past. Relationships are unstable, he thought, scrolling through an article on surrogacy. This isn't about romance. It's about control. A clear plan with no room for chaos. Edward leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. His second divorce had taught him to guard his emotions fiercely. Both ex-wives had been drawn to his wealth and status, not the man behind them. They loved the Edward Sterling the world saw, but never truly knew him. Determined, Edward made a series of calls. He spoke with lawyers and medical experts, meticulously crafting a plan. The surrogate would be compensated generously and cared for during the pregnancy. But after the birth, she'd be free to go. No strings, no complications. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the plan was set. As Edward locked his office and descended to his waiting car, he felt an unfamiliar flicker of anticipation. By this time next year, he thought, the Sterling name will have its heir. A week later, Edward navigated the streets of San Francisco in his matte black Tesla. The city buzzed with its usual chaos. Cyclists weaving between cars, pedestrians darting across intersections, and the distant hum of cable cars climbing steep hills. At a red light near Golden Gate Park, Edward's restless thoughts were interrupted by a faint knock on his window. He turned to see a young woman standing on the sidewalk, her hand hesitantly outstretched. She was disheveled, her clothes worn, and her eyes, bright green, and filled with a mix of hope and despair, held him captive for a moment longer than he intended. "Do you have anything to spare?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible over the city noise. Edward's expression hardened instinctively. "Get lost," he snapped, shifting his car into drive as the light turned green. But as he drove on, he couldn't shake the look in her eyes. There was something haunting about them, something that refused to fade. A few blocks away, Edward pulled over and exhaled sharply. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. But against his better judgment, he turned the car around. When he found her again, she was seated on a bench, sketching something on a crumpled piece of paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked. Edward rolled down the window. "Get in," he said, his tone sharp and commanding. She looked up, her gaze wary. "I'm not the kind of woman you're looking for. if that's what this is about. Edward raised an eyebrow, irritation flashing across his face. Do you honestly think I'd waste my time? I have a proposition for you, one that could change your life. Now, are you getting in or not? Sophia hesitated, her instincts screaming caution, but something about Edward's intensity felt oddly genuine. With a deep breath, she stood and climbed into the car, her fate now entwined with his. The ride back to Edward's home was steep in silence, interrupted only by the hum of the Tesla's engine. Sophia stared out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of questions and doubts. Who was this man, and why had he brought her here? When they arrived, Edward's mansion loomed before them, a modern fortress of steel and glass perched on the hills overlooking the bay. Sophia hesitated at the entrance, feeling out of place in her tattered clothes against the backdrop of pristine marble and minimalist design. Come in, Edward said curtly, holding the door open without a glance back. Inside, he led her to a spacious, impeccably furnished living room. He gestured for her to sit on the leather sofa while he poured himself a drink. For a moment, he studied her from across the room, his gray eyes calculating. Let's get straight to the point, Edward began, his voice calm but devoid of warmth. I need a child. Not a relationship, not a partner, just an heir to carry on my name. Sophia blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. A child? She echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I'm offering you financial security and the assurance that you'll be cared for throughout the pregnancy, he said, placing his drink down. In return, you'll agree to artificial insemination. Once the child is born, you're free to leave. No strings attached. Sophia stared at him, her mind racing. It wasn't just the audacity of the proposal that stunned her, but the cold detachment with which he spoke. And you think I'll just agree to this? She asked, her tone sharp despite her unease. I think you will, Edward replied unflinching, because whatever life you had before, it's clear it hasn't given you the stability you need. This is your chance to change that. Sophia's jaw tightened, her pride clashing with her desperation. After a long pause, she nodded, her voice trembling. Fine, I'll do it. Edward's lips curved into a faint smile. Good. My lawyer will handle the details. Weeks passed, and the arrangement between Edward and Sophia settled into a strange rhythm. True to his word, Edward ensured Sophia had everything she needed: luxury accommodations, nutritious meals, and regular medical care. Yet, their interactions remained distant, businesslike, and devoid of warmth. But as Sophia's pregnancy progressed, cracks began to form in Edward's cold exterior. One evening, Edward found Sophia sitting on the terrace, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. The golden light of the setting sun bathed her face, and for a moment she seemed entirely at peace. Curious, despite himself, Edward approached. What are you drawing? He asked, his tone more curious than usual. Sophia glanced up, surprised. Just something from memory, she replied, turning the sketchbook slightly to show him. It was a simple yet evocative image, a field of wild flowers under a bright sky. Edward studied it for a moment before nodding. You're talented, he said, his voice softer than she expected. Sophia smiled faintly. It's been a while since anyone said that. The conversation lingered in Edward's mind long after he left. He found himself drawn to these small glimpses of Sophia's world, the way she laughed quietly at a book she was reading, how she hummed French lullabies to herself when she thought no one was listening. Sophia, in turn, began to see another side of Edward. One night, when she fainted from dizziness, Edward carried her to her room himself, refusing to call for staff. His gestures were awkward, but they betrayed a side of him she hadn't thought existed, a side that cared. As the months went on, their interactions grew less formal. They began sharing meals together, trading stories of their vastly different lives. Edward told her about his parents, who had passed away before he could make peace with them, and Sophia spoke of the dream she once had as a painter in Paris. Though neither of them acknowledged it, something was changing. Edward no longer saw Sophia as just the surrogate, and Sophia began to notice the warmth that occasionally flickered beneath his composed exterior. The walls between them weren't fully broken, but they were no longer impenetrable. The day Sophia gave birth dawned with the soft hues of a San Francisco sunrise, casting a warm glow over the city. Edward paced the hallway of the hospital, his normally composed demeanor betraying signs of nervousness. Inside the delivery room, Sophia's cries of effort and determination echoed, each one tugging at something deep within him. Hours later, the sound of the first newborn's cry pierced the air. A nurse stepped out, announcing with a smile, "It's a boy." Moments later, another cry followed, and then another. "Triplets," the nurse said, her tone filled with awe. Edward entered the room slowly, his heart racing. He saw Sophia lying in the bed, exhausted but glowing with an indescribable joy. In her arms were three tiny, wriggling infants, a boy, another boy, and a girl. Her tears flowed freely as she gazed at them, her fingers delicately brushing against their tiny cheeks. "They're perfect," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Edward stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sight. His gaze moved between Sophia and the babies, a swell of emotions crashing over him. Joy, awe, and an ache he couldn't name. He reached out hesitantly, touching the tiny hand of one of the boys, who instinctively gripped his finger. But beneath the joy, a painful truth loomed. The contract. Sophia's time with the children was limited, and the thought gnawed at her heart. As the days passed, she spent every moment she could with them, memorizing their faces and cherishing their soft coos. But with each passing hour, the weight of her impending departure grew heavier. One night, as she cradled her daughter in her arms, tears slipped silently down her cheeks. Edward entered quietly, watching her from the doorway. "I don't want to leave them," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But I will. I gave you my word." Edward's chest tightened as he approached her. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of her sacrifice. No contract, he thought, can account for this. For Edward, a man used to controlling everything, the realization was shattering. He knew he couldn't let her go, not like this. The morning Sophia was set to leave, the air in Edward's mansion was heavy with silence. She moved through the house with a slow, deliberate pace, gathering her belongings into a small suitcase. The triplets were asleep in their cribs, blissfully unaware of what was about to happen. As she descended the grand staircase, her heart felt like it was breaking with every step. At the massive front door, she placed a trembling hand on the doorknob, ready to honor the terms of the contract she had signed months ago. "Where are you going?" Edward's voice rang out from behind her, startling her. Sophia froze but didn't turn around. "You know why I'm leaving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The contract is clear." Edward stepped closer, his usually composed demeanor visibly shaken. "To hell with the contract," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sophia finally turned, her tear-streaked face meeting his. Edward pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and without a second thought began tearing it to shreds. The fragments of the contract fell to the floor like snow, leaving both of them in stunned silence. "I can't let you leave," Edward said, his voice breaking. "Not just because of the children, but because of you. You've changed everything, Sophia. I thought I wanted an heir, someone to carry on my name, but I realize now I want something much more. I want a family. I want you." Sophia stared at him, her breath catching. She had spent months convincing herself that this arrangement was purely transactional, but deep down, she had always hoped for more. "I've loved you since the moment you turned back from me that night," she confessed, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to admit it, but It's true. Edward stepped forward, his gray eyes locked on hers. Stay, he whispered. Not because of the contract, but because we belong together. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes as she dropped her suitcase and stepped into his arms. For the first time, they embraced not as two strangers bound by a deal, but as partners, ready to face the future together. Months later, Edward's once cold mansion was transformed into a warm and lively home. The laughter of children filled the air, a sound that softened even the stark modernity of the house. The triplets, now several months old, were the center of attention, their tiny hands reaching for toys and each other as they played on a soft rug. Sophia sat on the floor with them, her bright green eyes filled with joy as she watched her daughter try to crawl. Edward stood nearby, leaning against the doorway, his usually serious face softened by a rare smile. "What are you thinking about?" Sophia asked, glancing up at him. Edward stepped forward, lowering himself to sit beside her. "I'm thinking about how much my life has changed," he admitted, "and how grateful I am for it. For you." Sophia reached over, taking his hand. "I think we both found something we didn't know we needed." Their wedding had been a quiet affair, attended only by close friends and family. Edward, once a man driven by control and logic, had embraced the unpredictable, chaotic beauty of love and family. Sophia, who had thought she'd lost her way in life, found herself exactly where she was meant to be. As Edward held his son, one of the triplets, in his arms, he looked at Sophia and their children and felt a deep contentment. "I thought I needed an heir," he said softly, "but what I really needed was a family." The story ends with a lingering shot of the family, framed by the golden light of sunset, a testament to the power of love to heal and transform even the most guarded hearts.